introduction. So we have today the great pleasure of having another Logos one, yet remote. But it allows us to have William today with us. So William will be speaking to us for, as usual, for about 20 minutes. And what do we know about him? William works currently at Swiss RE, has been 12 years in that business, and now leads something interesting that's called the behavioral science and customer experience function within their startup insurance division. So that sounds like a very clever job, William. But we'll be interested today to hear from you about our topic. And sorry. So of course, the topic is also very clever. So our question today is being a Christian reasonable or an irrational thing to do or to be? So very profound question, and we'll be very interested to hear from you, William, and your thoughts on it. Thank you for being with us. Over to you.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be with you guys. I grew up, like I said a minute ago, in the Ardennes. So I'm really, really close by in Saint-Hubert, which is a small town next to, kind of close-ish to Bastogne and Libramont. So we used to go into Luxembourg to fill up with petrol. That was the thing I used to do when I was a kid on the Sunday with my friend Francois. And a few times I actually went into Luxembourg for some piano exams. I had to do those. The associated board exams were held in Luxembourg. So I went into Luxembourg City for that. We'd also go to Wiltz for this amazing outdoor swimming pool. So those are my memories of Luxembourg growing up. And then when I was 18, I moved over to the UK to study business and German. And then I got the job at Swiss Re and I've been there for 12 years. And then in parallel to that, I'm an elder at our church here in Brentwood. And I've just gone down to 4 days a week so that I can do a bit more ministry stuff on the side on Fridays. So hence preparing and delivering this talk. So it's a real privilege to be with you guys. I hear that I think my brother has given a talk in this group and my dad. So that's like the third in the trilogy. And I hope I don't let the Trump team down. You can give us marks out of 10 afterwards, and hopefully I won't come out on the bottom. But our talk for today and our topic, as you said, Birgit, is following Jesus, rational or irrational. And I think a lot of people ask themselves that question, to be honest. Either they ask it out loud and they say, come on, this is just a massive leap of faith, leap in the dark. Or they kind of think it quietly. They think, actually, come on, guys, Christians are just, they've left their brain at the door and they just do it because they need it or they go along with it. Maybe you're a Christian on this call and you're thinking, is this really a reasonable decision to have made? Is it worth it to invest so much of my time, my energy, and the cost it involves? Or maybe you're on this call, you're not a Christian, you wouldn't call yourself a follower of Jesus, and you just think, well, Christians, they're just kind of, gullible. They'll just believe anything. And today's passage we're going to read finishes with these words: they left everything and followed him, right? So when you hear those words, do you think that is so over the top? That's like an extremist view. That's just irrational. Well, that's what we're going to explore today. So I will ask you to look up in your Bibles, please, Luke chapter 5. So hopefully you have a physical Bible or an electronic version that you can access. Luke chapter 5, just 11 verses. That's going to teach us so much about the basics of discipleship, and it's going to tackle this question of reasonable or irrational. So please look up Luke chapter 5, and I will read now verses 1 to 11. On one occasion, while the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, and he saw 2 boats by the lake, but the fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. Getting into one of the boats, which was Simon's, he asked him to put out a little from the land. And he sat down and taught the people from the boat. And when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." And Simon answered, "Master, we toiled all night and took nothing, but at your word I will let down the nets." And when they had done this, they enclosed a large number of fish, and their nets were breaking. They signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them, and they came and filled both the boats so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching men. And when they had brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him. Like I said, there's so much in here to teach us about the very basics of the Christian walk. Now, firstly, we need to just briefly set the scene. What is happening? Well, if you were to read Luke chapters 1 to 4, you'd see that Jesus is doing a lot of miracles. And so there's lots of people following him, people interested, intrigued. They want to see this miracle worker for themselves. But Jesus specifically points out that his aim is to teach. We see that actually in the sort of 2 verses at the end of the previous chapter. If you look up the page, you see in verse 43 of chapter 4, I must preach the good news, for that I was sent for this purpose. So yes, miracles, but Jesus says, I want to be teaching. And that's what he's doing here, isn't it? He's teaching by the edge of the lake, and he uses the boat to push out onto land. Now, by the way, when we say Simon, we're going to talk a lot about Simon. We say Simon or we say Peter interchangeably. That's because Jesus renamed him Peter. So hopefully that's not confusing. Simon, Peter, it's the same guy. And what we're going to do today is we're going to cover 3 main points that sort of summarize this passage. The first point is the unreasonable demands of Jesus, what I'm calling the unreasonable demands of Jesus. And you can notice that I've put it there in sort of speech marks because it seems unreasonable, doesn't it, what Jesus asks of Peter? Let me read verse 4 to you again. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch. How do you think Simon felt when Jesus asked him to do this? Probably mildly exasperated. And I think you can kind of get that even in the tone. He says, we toiled all night and took nothing. It's almost worse than that. It's like a clash of the trades. You've got Simon Peter, professional fisherman, Jesus, carpenter. It's like at work when you get told how to do your job by someone in a completely different department. You're like, back off. You don't know what you're talking about. And here Jesus telling a fisherman how to do his job. Quite weird, isn't it? It's actually also quite insensitive because Simon Peter has been up all night fishing. So he's just, cleaning the nets, mending the nets and wants to get to sleep. And Jesus is saying, no, go back out into the boat. Insensitive, also probably quite irrational. We're told that at the time, going into the deep was where there was less fish. It was more close to the shore. And you never do it during the day because the fish can see your nets. You go out at night, which is what they've done. So almost an irrational, insensitive, annoying request. Jesus is making this seemingly foolish request of Peter. And how does he respond? Well, there's a great lesson for this for us just in his words. He says, Master, at your word, I will. Do you see that in verse 5? We toiled all night and took nothing, but at your word, I will let down the nets. It's quite a good lesson there for us. If you're a Christian today, you probably are similar to that. You hear Jesus' teaching and you put up a bit of a fight, but the right thing to do is to say, but at your word, I will do this. Jesus says, submit to your boss and respect the authorities. And you want to say to Jesus, but you don't know my boss. He's really annoying. And we've got to say, but at your will, at your word, I will. Or the Bible is very clear, it's right for us to marry, be together with Christians. And someone says, well, but you just don't know how good looking she is. And we need to say like Peter, but at your word, I will obey. And what happens when he does obey? Well, it's amazing, isn't it? The huge mammoth catch of fish that he gets in verse 6 and 7. And I think this is why Luke, the historian, puts in so much detail. He says, a large number of fish, the nets were breaking. They signal to their partners in the other boats. So there's more evidence, more eyewitnesses. They fill both boats and they begin to sink. There's so much evidence there of what's going on. Turns out that Jesus's foolish request actually was cover for his goodness and his miraculous catch of fish. So we called this section the unreasonable demands of Jesus, but it really is just in inverted commas. It's not unreasonable at all. But it is unreasonable in the world's eyes. And that's the same for us today. I think the things that Jesus asks us to do as his followers in the world's eyes seem really unreasonable. Think about most of your colleagues, your friends, they are just chasing after money, status, pleasure, enjoyment, relationships, whatever it is, and they'll sacrifice anything for those things. And Jesus says, don't chase after those things. They don't fulfill you anyway. Instead, turn to me, follow me. Look out for the people who are the nobodies. Give some of your money away. Be committed to your local church. And the world says, well, that's just weird and unreasonable. And yet when we look at the evidence, actually, it's a very reasonable request. Now, what's interesting is you could end here, right? The miracle has happened. The fish have been caught. End of story. But why does the text give us much more detail? And I think this is because it's got more to teach us in the reactions of the people at the time. For example, let's look at Simon Peter's reaction. He's just caught a ton of fish. How does he respond? Well, for a start, the fact that he falls on his knees, we see that in verse 8, shows that he realizes this is miraculous, right? This is not just like a fluke. You know, if we went bowling together and I got 5 strikes in a row, you might say, nice one, or you might say, lucky shot, or you might buy me a beer or pat me on the back, but I don't think you'd start worshiping me as a divine creature. And yet what happens here for Peter is so clearly a mark of the divine that he is on his knees. Also, he addresses Jesus differently. Did you notice that in verse 5, he says master, so it's like a mark of respect, but by verse 8, he's saying Lord. Now, I know this group is interested in Greek because you've called it logos. So the word here in the Greek is kurios, which means Lord. It can mean sir, or it can mean Lord. And in Luke's gospel so far, it's only been used, this word, to talk about God himself. So what Peter is doing here is he's talking to Jesus as if he's in the presence of a divine being or God himself. But the most surprising thing is what Peter actually says. You know, what would you expect a fisherman to say after he's done, you know, a bad job all night, and then Jesus with one word has turned it all around? You'd probably expect him to say, get away from me, I'm a rubbish fisherman, right? Or I was wrong to doubt you. And instead he says, depart from me, for I am a sinful man. I'm a sinful man. This is our second point this lunchtime. The insight Jesus brings. The insight Jesus brings. He says, get away from me, for I am a sinful man. Why would he say that? It's really interesting, isn't it? In the presence of a being who he believes is divine, he responds by talking about his own sinfulness. Now, that is classic Bible behavior when you're in the presence of the holiness of God. For example, Isaiah in chapter 6, verse 5, when he's in the presence of God, he says, woe is me, for I am lost, and I am a man of unclean lips, and I've seen the King, the Lord of hosts. When you are in the presence of God and the holiness of God, the right response is to see your own failure and inadequacy and sinfulness. That is a core part of the Christian message. That's a part we cannot hide. We must acknowledge it. This is what happens here. He comes face to face with Jesus, and he's confronted with his own sinfulness. And if that's new for you today, I know it's not popular in our culture to talk about our own sinfulness and inadequacy and failures, but it's what the Bible teaches. And if we're honest with ourselves, we know it's true. Reminds me a bit of that first Matrix film where Neo goes to meet the Oracle, and there's a sign in Latin above the door that says, know yourself. And she's trying to encourage him to kind of know deep down who he is. I think we could say the same here, right? Do we know deep down that we are sinful and failures? I know I am. And rather than trying to hide that, when we come face to face with Jesus, it exposes our own failure. And that's when we can begin following him. Then we get to the next surprise, which is how Jesus reacts to Peter's admission. You know, when Peter says to Jesus, I'm a sinful man, how would you expect Jesus to react? Maybe you think Jesus is going to say, oh gosh, change of plan then. If I've got a sinful man here in front of me, I can't have him on my team. Let's find someone else. I don't know if you've ever had that at work when a boss comes to you, a senior manager, and says, we'd like you to lead this high profile project. And then you respond by listing all the things you're not good at, right? I've never done it in this country. I've never worked with these people. And as you're describing all these things, they change their mind and they go, okay, not this guy for this project. And that feels rubbish, doesn't it? When you realize you are inadequate and therefore you get deselected. And yet here it's exactly the opposite. Peter says, depart from me, for I'm a sinful man. Jesus doesn't disagree with him. Yes, you are a sinful man, but Jesus says, I've got work for you to do. You can be on my team. That's just amazing, isn't it? And that's something we're learning in this passage, is that Jesus has work for inadequate failures like us, like Simon Peter, to do. And what is that work? Well, we see here at the end of verse 10, from now on, you will be catching men. That's amazing, isn't it? He's kind of using the language of catching fish to say, in the same way that this net is full of fish, the kingdom of God will grow as people are brought in, and you're going to be involved in this. Now, this again is the same for us today, and I think it's encouraging, but also challenging. Encouraging because we're in Jesus' team if we admit our own weaknesses. He wants us in the team. We can be one of his followers. But also it's challenging because it means there's no opt-out. You can't say, well, I'm too rubbish for this job. And I think sometimes when it comes to things like Christian living, sanctification, living a holy life, or even evangelism, we say, well, actually, Jesus, I'm just never been very good at, telling people about my faith. And Jesus says, that's fine. I've got work for inadequate people like you and like me. Now we're coming to our final point this lunchtime. We've had the seemingly unreasonable demands of Jesus that were not unreasonable at all. We've had the insight that Jesus brings to the person, to Simon Peter and to us. And thirdly, we have the reasonableness of following Jesus, the reasonableness of following Jesus. As I said earlier, this passage ends with these words, when they brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him. Does that seem reasonable to you? A bit over the top? It's worth really letting it sink in, right? They left everything and followed him. We know they had a business. They were fishermen. They had these partners. They've just caught tons of fish. So there's a lot of money to be made there if they were to sell those. They've got their family, their homes, and they leave it all behind to follow Jesus. What would make someone do something so extreme? Well, it's an encounter with Jesus, isn't it? A real encounter with the living Jesus, the living Lord Jesus that they want to follow. And actually, in the light of what's just happened, that is a reasonable reaction. When you've seen Jesus do that, they respond by following him. How do we feel today about our call to follow Jesus? The Bible does not teach us that we need to sell our houses, leave our jobs, move away from our parents necessarily to follow him. But it does tell us that we should have all those things in secondary priority to following Jesus. Following Jesus needs to become number one. Jesus says, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all the other things will be added to you. So maybe you're not a Christian on this call. You would not describe yourself a follower of Jesus. You think it's irrational to follow Jesus. I hope this passage has challenged you. If you were to talk to Simon Peter, he would say his decision was totally rational in light of the evidence. And if you are a Christian, maybe you're facing the ups and downs of life and you struggle to follow Jesus day by day. Be encouraged by Simon Peter. He too had doubts. He put up a bit of a fight, but actually he then witnessed Jesus' amazing power. Peter will actually go on to write a letter, two letters actually, 1 Peter and 2 Peter. 1 Peter in particular, I find just so encouraging. And in this, he writes to a bunch of people who've never seen Jesus. These people are dotted around Turkey, and he writes to them to say, even though you've not seen Jesus, you love him. He can say to them, I've seen Jesus, I'm an apostle. You haven't seen him, and yet you love him. And you have an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, unfading, guaranteed through the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, which he himself witnessed in person. And when I thought that scattered small groups of Christians across Turkey, which is what the letter 1 Peter is written to, I thought of scattered Christians dotted around Luxembourg and Essex, where I live, and the rest of Europe and the whole world. We are just the same as Peter's people to whom he wrote that first letter. So let's wrap up for this lunchtime. We've seen these core elements of being a disciple in just 11 verses. Interestingly, Jesus says he wants to teach, but we don't get any teaching in this chunk. I think because he's doing a live demo. It's like teaching by doing rather than teaching with words. Through this miracle, he's teaching us the reasonableness of following him. He makes seemingly unreasonable demands, but they're not unreasonable at all, actually. His disciples, like you and me, like Simon Peter, they put up a bit of a fight, but they obey his word. When you encounter Jesus, you become aware of your own inadequacies, your sin, your failure, and that's good. That's a necessary step into following Jesus. And the good news is Jesus does not respond to your admission of inadequacy by kicking you off the team. quite the opposite. He brings you on the team. He says, I've got work for people like you to do. And so they leave everything to follow him. Is that reasonable? Well, ask Peter. He would say it definitely is. In fact, the Bible would go so far as to say that what's unreasonable in the light of the evidence of Jesus Christ is not to follow him. So let's be like Peter in the way we follow Jesus. That's it from me, from the text, and happy to discuss and hear any questions people might have.